Ce podcast vous est proposé avec la participation de fanshop No Watch. Salut à tous et bienvenue dans Slap, le podcast qui claque pour ne rien rater de l'actu des séries. Cette semaine, préparez-vous à une grande claque avec une interview de David Simon. Nous avons pu rencontrer ce grand nom des séries, journaliste puis scénariste de séries à succès qui est à l'origine de séries cultes dont The Wire ou Séries courtes et Homicide. C'est d'ailleurs à l'occasion de la sortie en français de son livre Baltimore, qui a servi de base à la série Homicide, que David Simon était à Paris.
I read about it in this book.
Now, since when did you ever read a book?
I read this book. An excerpt of this book.
See, that's what I'm saying, man. You said you read a book, but you didn't read nothing but an
It
excerpt.
says that you never really find what you're looking for, because the whole point is looking for it. So if you find it, it defeats its own purpose.
David, est-ce que vous pouvez nous raconter comment est né ce livre Homicide?
I was a police reporter for the daily newspaper in Baltimore, and I'd covered crime. That was my beat for about 4 years in the mid-'80s. And at a certain point, I realized everything I was writing were in these little bite-sized morsels. A 19-year-old man was killed. There were no witnesses, no suspects. Very, very antiseptic. And the whole sense of the city as being having this profound struggle with poverty and with violence was sort of not registering in that kind of coverage anymore. It was too disparate, too bite-sized. So I thought if they'd let me in the homicide unit and I could follow the people who were contending with this every day, there might be a different way to slice it and to make it resonant and make people feel the dynamic again. And incredibly, they let me in.
Qu'est-ce que vous avez commencé votre carrière au Baltimore Sun en 1982. Qu'est-ce que vous avez découvert durant cette année, 1988, où vous avez écrit vous avez fait cette enquête, et que vous ne saviez pas pendant ces 6 premières années au Baltimore Sun?
I already knew what the detectives did on a practical basis because I've been covering them 4 years, and I'd written a lot of murder stories, and you would call them up when stuff happened, and you would find out what they were attempting to do and what the general parameters of death investigation were in a city like Baltimore. What I didn't learn was the interior politics and dynamics of what happens when death investigation is on an assembly line, when murder is no longer an extraordinary act, and a human being taking another human being's life is no longer an extraordinary act, but it's an ordinary act. And that was a transformational moment. I think that's what makes the book very different from all the crime fiction and all of the American television entertainment that deals with violence. We have a lot of conceits and a lot of myths about who we are as a people and what and a lot of them are aspirational. They're what we want to believe we are, and we want to believe that when somebody kills somebody, it's a big deal, and that it will be avenged. And in truth, these guys were trying to do their jobs, and some of them were very good at their jobs, but you have a certain number of days to turn a murder around, and then another murder comes, because Baltimore, a very typical American city, has about 240, 250 murders in a year, in this year, and even in a good year, 210, 220 murders in a city of only maybe 600,000. So you look at that and you say, certain realities are present, and the world is not nearly as clean as we like to pretend it to be.
Comment vous décririez l'évolution de la ville de Baltimore entre le moment où vous écrivez Homicide et le moment où vous allez tourner The Wire au début des années 2000?
Oh, I don't think it changed all that much. There were some transformations. We have less population. We're probably down. I think when I did this book, we were probably at about 680,000. We're probably down about 80, maybe 70,000. So a lot of that had to do with that run up on Wall Street for about 15 years, where there was a lot of economic gain in the country, and some people were able to crawl out of the underclass and become working class or even middle class. So there were less poor, and then part of it had to do with a lot of the city's problems transmitting to the suburbs, because the physical plant of the inner city had been so run down, and so much of it had disappeared, so many vacants had fallen or become unlivable, that that we were sort of depopulated in a way that you've seen in other sort of cities with a lot of brownfields, like Detroit, and that happened. So you started to see suburbs that had crime problems because it had migrated. I think that's a dynamic that would be more akin to what you have in Paris, actually. So there was a decline in population. It got worse before it got better after the book in terms of the drug war. The drug war became even more hyperbolic, and our rates of incarceration continued to increase. And of course, part of that was in response to a genuine epidemic in cocaine use. Heroin was one thing, but at the book was the beginning of the cocaine epidemic in America, at least on the East Coast, and that probably peaked in the early 90s. Since then, rates of cocaine use have actually gone down. Heroin's stayed about constant, but we sort of weathered that storm. And then at a certain point, to give some credit to the city, the latest police commissioner took over, and he did something that the other book, The Corner, that we worked on, argues for. He de-emphasized drug arrests, and he stopped chasing street-level drug enforcement, and he focused on guns and on violence. And they've managed to get the murder rate down by a good 15 to 20%, for a couple of years by basically de-emphasizing the drug war and by emphasizing violence. So tactically, I think they've made some good decisions lately.
En 1993, Homicide est devenu une série télé qui a duré 7 saisons. C'était important pour vous le prolongement de ce livre en série télé?
Sure. I was delighted. The show was a strange stepchild for me. You have to imagine, I was a police reporter. I'd written a book of narrative nonfiction. I had no thought about television when I wrote it. I was hoping I would sell enough copies that they would let me write a second book if I had a second idea. And at some point, the rights for the book sold to Barry Levinson and Tom Fontana, and they came to town to make a network television show based on it. I thought the show was remarkably good drama.
Hey, we're police. Go rob somebody else.
You want it? You ready? Take it.
Detective Bayless.
And I certainly was elated that it brought attention to the book, and I started selling books at a better clip. But it was a strange stepchild because it was filming fictionally. The stories were fictionalized, and this sort of make-believe story was going on in the town where I was still a reporter. And what I do remember is I could never get on the phone with anybody from a judge to a lawyer to a cop without first hearing about whatever that week's episode was and hearing their opinions on that which I had no real control over, or could claim no credit for it, in a good sense. So it was a very strange vibe. And then as my newspaper began to diminish, bad things started happening to journalism in America as early as the 90s, way before the internet. It was more complicated than that. But as the Baltimore Sun became less of a home for me, they offered me a chance to write some scripts, and I thought I sort of did it as a lark. I was not paying real attention to the possibilities of television. It was a new skill set to learn. It was interesting. I did it with a friend who liked TV a lot more than I did. But I thought I would stay in journalism. So that was my experience with Homicide. But I did go to work. At a certain point, the newspaper was reducing its staff. They were offering veteran reporters a year's salary. I took the buyout. I went to work for the television show. I didn't see it as permanent. I had no plan to leave journalism permanently leave journalism for television, but that's what happened.
Est-ce qu'il y a des choses que vous avez dites dans la série Homicide et que vous n'avez pas pu dire soit dans le livre, soit au Baltimore Sun?
Well, very much so. Journalism has a rigor to it and a demand that everything be provable. My early editor said to me that if your mother says she loves you, get two sources on that. And there was a real belief that opinions and analysis, even if you were trying not to be ideological or or trying to divorce your own personal biases from what you thought was going on, you really needed to be careful with that. That the facts themselves were the predominant currency, and necessarily so. When you were doing narrative journalism and you're following people around, as I was following the detectives around for a year, or later as I was following drug dealers around for a year, okay, you make choices about what to put in, what to put out. That's where you have your most editorial influence. But television and fictionalization is liberating in one sense. You now can venture. You almost have a responsibility as a dramatist to make choices that make the argument you think the piece should make. It's much less of a simple declarative assessment of what's happening, which journalism is and must be because of its rigor and its ethos, and more of a in the way of literature. Film is visual literature. It's a chance for the storyteller to make an argument about what he thinks is important and what he thinks is going on. He may be right, he may be wrong, but those themes are supposed to be in there. Dramatic choices are supposed to be made about what happens and doesn't happen in your story that gives the story resonance. So all of a sudden, it's more akin to an editorial. I'm now going to tell you what I think by virtue of the story I decide to show you and what happens in that story. And very different. I was able to say more about what I actually believe, of course.
Pour revenir à votre métier de journaliste, un de vos collègues du Baltimore Sun disait que vous aviez une expression pour parler de votre métier qui est God's work. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer ce que ça veut dire?
I thought there was a purity to journalism that appealed to me. I was a peculiar kid in that I grew up in a liberal democratic, a New Deal household. We were all sort of New Deal Democrats. Roosevelt New Deal, union, organized labor, and there were degrees of liberalism. I was to the left of my older brother. My sister was in the middle. My father was a little more centrist. My mother was sometimes, and we argued. Argument was sport to us where I grew up. You demonstrated your intellectual prowess within the family by coming to dinner and arguing about what was in the paper that day. We took every newspaper we could. We took all the news magazines. The house was stacked with books. My father was a great consumer of nonfiction, particularly politics and history. And argument was sport. It's what we did. It's what it never became so heated that we thought for a moment we were really human beings arguing with each other because we were angry. But it did become heated. And if you think about it, it was almost a perfect hothouse for raising a newspaper reporter. And at one point in The Wire, later on when we were discussing journalism, I think I called a healthy newsroom a place where people argue about everything all the time. I could have just been easily describing my dinner table at the house in which I grew up in my family. And so the idea of being paid real money and being allowed to spend my days going around a city like Baltimore or any place that was as interesting as an American city and finding that which was a source of conflict or worthy of argument and contributing to the argument in some way, either by presenting something evidentiary or by contradicting something which was presumed to be true that maybe wasn't, or just by providing more information, or by learning a story that was on its face interesting and said something about an issue or an argument. That was, I almost, in the beginning, I think, for years and years, I would have almost paid them to let me do that job. It was good they gave me a salary and that it was, because we were a union shop, it was something I could live on, because I probably would have never had the sense of even needing a paycheck. I just loved it so much.
En 2004, vous avez déclaré dans une interview que depuis que vous aviez quitté le journalisme, vous étiez devenu cynique sur le pouvoir de ce média. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire un petit peu ce que vous vouliez dire par là? Est-ce que c'est ce que vous avez voulu dire dans la 5e saison de The Wire?
Oh, I have no cynicism with regard to the necessity for it. I believe in it. I believe it's essential for representative Republican government, small r Republican government. I believe that it is endangered right now because the revenue stream has been disrupted. That would be the primary worry, is that as we've gone to a digital model, the preservation of copyright and the willingness of the consumer to pay for the maintenance of a news organization that covers society has been endangered. But actually, journalism was in trouble before then. I took a buyout from the Baltimore Sun in 1995, long before the internet. They were already reducing staff because Wall Street had figured out that you could make lots more money putting out a shittier newspaper than a good one. And that's what they did. When I started at the Baltimore Sun, there were 500 people covering Central Maryland, my region. Right now there's 125 in the Baltimore Sun newsroom. When I left, I was one of 100 people leaving. All of them veterans, all of them offered a year's salary, all of them with other prospects. You know, I was going to a television show. I was going to make more money. But I was still very ambivalent about leaving. I only left because I thought this paper is becoming the paper's becoming something that I'm not comfortable with. And what they value in journalism, I don't value, and what I value, they don't value. And that was the parting of the ways. But I'm not cynical about the purposes of it. I think we need to get it away from the notion that profit is the metric by which we measure something that has such essential civic value as journalism. And I also think that the product itself has to be a product. We have to be able to sell it, whether online or offline, in hard copy or not. If you can't sell something, it isn't a product, and that's a more fundamental problem. I don't think information can be free. I don't think the internet or bloggers or do they have the phrase citizen journalism here in France? I don't believe in that phrase. There is no such thing. Journalism is a profession. You pay people to do it. You pay people to go to the same beats day in and day out and learn sources and not learn how to be tricked by sources and to find documents and to really learn what's going on. That's, I believe in it. So my cynicism is about what happened to it, but not about the purposes behind it.
How is the subject of The Wire season 5?
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of affection for journalism in season 5. Season 5 begins with a great act of journalism in the first episode. The city editor finds something low down on the agenda for the city council, and he breaks out a story that nobody would have known about. And it ends with a great piece of journalism where somebody tells the story of bubbles in a narrative way that has great meaning. In the middle, there is a very strong critique about how journalism lost its way and what journalism needed to value again and what newsrooms no longer value. But none of that mitigates against my desire to see newspapers be strong and healthy and maintain a watchdog role in our society.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On se retrouve la semaine prochaine pour une nouvelle distribution de claques. D'ici là, n'oubliez pas d'aller sur le site No Watch soutenir tous vos podcasts préférés. Bonne semaine à tous, ciao!